The first time it happened, I was already awake, lying on my side and staring at the dim blue numbers of the clock, when the sound came from outside my bedroom door, a soft, rhythmic tapping that stopped just long enough for me to think it was my heart, or the pipes before it started again, in a careful pattern of 3 slow taps, and a pause, and then 3 more. And I remember thinking how strange it was that I didn't feel scared right away, just annoyed, because I live alone, and nothing ever touches that door at night. And as I lay there listening, the tapping shifted slightly lower, as if whoever or whatever was doing it was adjusting their height to match the handle. And that was when I noticed something else. Something wrong, in a way I couldn't immediately explain, which was that my dog wasn't reacting at all. Because normally, even a leaf brushing the porch sends him into a frenzy. But the room was silent, except for that tapping and the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. And when the tapping finally stopped, it left behind a kind of pressure in the air, like the moment after someone stops knocking, but before you decide whether to answer. And I lay there holding my breath until I realized the pressure wasn't fading. It was settling, as if something had decided to wait. I didn't open the door that night. I told myself it was nothing and fell asleep eventually. But the next morning, when I stepped into the hallway, I saw 3 faint marks on the paint near the handle. Not scratches exactly, more like smudges, arranged in a way that made my stomach tighten because they were exactly where knuckles would land if someone stood there, patiently tapping and pausing, tapping and pausing. And when I wiped them away, they left a colder patch on the wall that stayed even after the rest of the paint warmed in the sun. I tried to laugh it off and went to work, but all day there was a feeling of being slightly out of sync, like I was a half-second behind the world. And when I came home that evening, my dog refused to cross the threshold, planting his feet and whining until I carried him inside. And even then, he stayed pressed against my legs, watching the hallway as if he expected something to come from it. That night, the tapping returned, but this time it wasn't at my bedroom door. It was at the front door of the house, slow and deliberate. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. And between the pauses, I could hear breathing, not heavy or panicked, just calm, measured breaths that seemed to come from someone standing very close to the door. And I remember thinking how odd it was that whoever it was didn't knock like a normal person, didn't ring the bell or call out my name, just tapped as if following a rule only they understood. I stayed still and waited for it to stop, and eventually it did. But when I checked the door in the morning, there were no marks this time, just the faint smell of something metallic that faded as soon as the door opened. Over the next few weeks, the tapping became part of my nights, always in sets of 3, always moving slightly. Sometimes the bedroom door, sometimes the hallway wall, sometimes the window above the sink, and each time it stopped before I worked up the courage to investigate, leaving behind that same sense of pressure, that same feeling of being watched from just outside my field of vision. And I started to notice patterns, like how it never happened before midnight and never continued past 3 in the morning, or how it always stopped if I turned on all the lights, but resumed the moment I switched one off, as if the darkness itself was an invitation. I told a friend about it once, tried to explain without sounding paranoid, and they laughed and suggested it was pipes or branches or stress. But that night, when I lay in bed, listening to the tapping on the wall behind my head, I realized something new. Something that made my mouth go dry, which was that the tapping was responding to me, because when I shifted in bed, it paused, and when I held my breath, it waited, and when I whispered my dog's name, it started again. 3 taps, closer this time, right where my head rested against the wall, as if it had leaned in to listen. That was the first night I heard it speak, not in words exactly, but in a sound that had the shape of words. A soft exhale that brushed against the wall and made my skin prickle. And I couldn't make out what it was saying, but I knew it was meant for me, and I knew somehow that answering, even with a scream, would be a mistake. After that night, things began to change in small ways that were easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Like how my clocks started losing time but only at night, or how I'd find doors slightly ajar that I knew I'd closed, or how my reflection in the mirror seemed to lag just a fraction of a second behind my movements when I checked it after midnight. And the tapping continued, patient and persistent, never growing louder or more aggressive, just consistent, as if it knew it didn't need to rush. I tried sleeping with headphones on, with white noise, with the TV blaring, but the tapping always found its way through, sometimes syncing with the rhythm of whatever I was listening to, turning familiar sounds into something wrong, something intentional, and I began to dread the quiet moments, the pauses between taps, where I could feel its attention focused on me like a weight. One night, exhausted and frustrated, I broke one of the rules I'd unconsciously been following and tapped back. 3 slow taps on the mattress with my fingers, and the response was immediate. A sharp series of taps right on the other side of the wall, closer than it had ever been, followed by that soft, almost amused exhale. And in that moment, I understood that it wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to get me to acknowledge it, to meet it halfway, and the realization settled over me like cold water. After that, the tapping changed, becoming more varied, sometimes 2 taps instead of 3, sometimes a single tap, followed by a long pause that stretched until my nerves were raw, and I found myself counting without meaning to, tracking patterns, trying to predict what it would do next. And in doing so, I realized I was thinking about it even during the day, anticipating it, making space for it in my routines. And that frightened me more than the tapping itself. The first time I saw it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden appearance or jump scare, just a glimpse in the corner of my eye as I passed the hallway mirror late one night. A shape that didn't quite match my own, standing a little too close behind me, its outline blurred as if it hadn't fully decided what it was yet. And when I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. But the tapping started immediately, loud and insistent, as if it were pleased to be noticed. I stopped inviting people over because I didn't want to explain the way the house felt after dark, the way the air seemed thicker, the way sounds carried differently, and I started sleeping with my bedroom door open because closing it made the tapping worse, more focused, as if it resented the barrier. And with the door open, I could sometimes convince myself that the tapping was just part of the house settling, just old wood and old pipes, even though deep down I knew better. One night, sometime after 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my own voice whispering. Not words I recognized, but a pattern that matched the tapping, and I realized with a sickening clarity that I was responding in my sleep, that whatever rules it was following, I was starting to learn them too. And when I lay there listening, I could hear another whisper just beyond the doorway, mirroring mine, practicing, and the sense of being watched deepened into something more intimate, more personal, like being studied. From then on, the tapping began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a conversation I was failing to understand, and I found myself waiting for it at night, lying awake with my heart pounding, listening for the first tap that would signal the beginning of another exchange. And on the nights when it didn't come, the silence felt wrong, oppressive, as if something had gone missing. I tried to leave once, packed a bag, and drove to a motel across town. But as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I heard it again. 3 taps on the nightstand, gentle and precise. And I knew then that it wasn't tied to the house, that it was tied to me. And the knowledge followed me back home like a shadow. Over time, the tapping started to change locations more freely, no longer confined to doors and walls, sometimes coming from inside the house in places it couldn't possibly be, like beneath the floorboards or inside the vents, and once, memorably, from right behind my ear as I sat on the couch trying to distract myself with television, and each time it came closer, more familiar, as if testing how much space I would give it. I began to notice that it avoided certain things, like mirrors during the day or rooms filled with sunlight, and I clung to those small victories, rearranging my life to minimize the times it could reach me. But nights are long, and darkness always returns, and with it, the tapping, steady and patient. The last change happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it. The way my own habits started to align with its patterns, the way I'd pause before entering a room as if waiting for permission, the way I'd tap my fingers in sets of 3 when I was nervous. And the realization hit me one night as I lay in bed, listening to the tapping on the ceiling above me, something that had never happened before, that it wasn't outside anymore, that it had learned enough, that it had followed the rules long enough to be inside, not fully, not visibly, but close enough that the line between us was thin and getting thinner. The tapping stopped that night, replaced by a quiet presence that filled the room without making a sound. And as I lay there staring into the darkness, I felt that familiar pressure settle over me, heavier than ever. And I understood that whatever it wanted, it was waiting for me to offer it, to make the final acknowledgement. And as the hours passed and dawn crept closer, I realized with a cold certainty that even when the tapping ends, the watching doesn't. And that somewhere just beyond my vision, something is still standing patiently, listening to my breathing, remembering my patterns, and waiting for me to tap back again. I didn't sleep after that realization settled in, because sleep felt like permission. And I had learned by then that permission mattered, that every small allowance became a rule it could use. So I lay there, watching the gray light seep into the room and listening to the house breathe. And when morning finally arrived, nothing looked different, which was somehow worse, because it meant whatever line had been crossed didn't leave marks you could point to. And the tapping didn't return that night either, or the next. And the silence stretched on long enough that I started to question myself, to wonder if exhaustion had finally tipped into imagination. But the pressure never left. That sense of being observed from a fixed distance, like someone standing just out of frame in a photograph. During the day, I'd catch myself pausing mid-step, waiting for a sound that never came. And at night, I'd lie awake, braced for tapping that refused to announce itself. And it was in that waiting that I noticed new things, subtle things, like how the shadows in the corners of rooms seemed deeper than they used to be. Not darker exactly, but more solid, as if they had weight. Or how my dog would sit up suddenly and stare at empty spaces with his head tilted, listening to something I couldn't hear. I tried to impose new rules of my own, keeping lights on, sleeping with the radio playing softly, avoiding mirrors after dark. And for a while it felt like it was working, like the quiet was a retreat. But then I started finding evidence that the conversation hadn't ended. It had just changed form, because objects in the house would be slightly out of place in the morning, not moved far, just rotated or aligned in ways that felt intentional, like 3 coasters stacked neatly instead of spread out, or books arranged so their spines formed patterns that mirrored the tapping rhythm I'd memorized without meaning to. One afternoon I came home early and found the hallway door to the spare room closed, which was strange because I never closed it. And when I opened it, there was nothing inside that I could see. But the air felt colder, denser, and as I stood there, I felt that same pressure concentrate, like a tension narrowing. and I closed the door again gently, as if I were the one intruding. That night I dreamed of tapping without sound, of a presence communicating through absence. And when I woke, I realized I had been tapping my fingers against my palm in my sleep. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. And my hand ached as if I'd been doing it for hours. I stopped trying to leave after that because everywhere felt the same, every unfamiliar space carrying the potential for that same attention. And I began to understand that it wasn't following me so much as waiting for me, letting me move around its orbit. And the idea that it could be patient in that way made my chest tighten. Weeks passed, then months, marked not by events, but by changes in how I noticed things, like how I became acutely aware of thresholds, doorways, the spaces between rooms, and how I'd hesitate before crossing them, listening for something that might signal approval or warning. And sometimes, very faintly, I'd hear it. Not tapping, but a subtle shift in the air, like fabric moving in a still room, and I'd freeze until it passed. The first time it touched me, I almost didn't recognize it as such, because it wasn't a hand or a grip, just a brief sensation of pressure on my shoulder as I stood at the sink late one night, light reflecting off the window like a dark mirror. And the pressure wasn't heavy or threatening, just present, as if someone had leaned in close enough to make contact. And I remember how my breath caught, how I stared at my reflection and saw nothing behind me, and how the pressure lingered just long enough to make denial impossible. After that, the rules became clearer, not because they were explained, but because breaking them brought consequences, small ones at first, like that suffocating pressure intensifying or the shadows seeming to crowd closer. And I learned to move carefully, to think before acting, to exist in a way that minimized friction. And in doing so, I felt myself shrinking, my world narrowing to the spaces and times where it felt safest, which were fewer than they used to be. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sense it standing just outside the bedroom, not tapping, just waiting. And the waiting felt heavier than the tapping ever had, because it implied expectation. And I'd lie there, wondering what it expected of me, what the end of this slow escalation looked like, and whether there was an end at all. I stopped marking time in normal ways, and started marking it by nights, when the pressure eased slightly, nights when it felt closer, nights when I woke with the certainty that something had changed, even if I couldn't say what. And through it all, there was a growing sense that I was being remembered, that every reaction, every hesitation, every small allowance was being cataloged. The quiet became the loudest thing in the house, filled with meanings I didn't have words for. And sometimes, I'd catch myself imagining what it might be like to finally acknowledge it fully, to turn toward that pressure and accept whatever came next. And the fact that the thought no longer felt purely terrifying scared me more than anything else, because it meant the line was thinner than ever. And even now, as I sit here listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, I know that somewhere just beyond my sight, something is still paying attention, still waiting patiently, not tapping anymore, because it doesn't need to, because it knows I hear it anyway. And it knows that, eventually, whether I mean to or not, I'll respond. After that understanding took hold, the days began to blur together in a way that made it hard to remember when things had been normal. Because normal relies on contrast, and contrast was disappearing. Everything flattening into a constant low tension that followed me from room to room, from waking to sleep. And I found myself listening more than living, measuring every sound against the memory of tapping, even though it never returned. And that absence became its own pattern, a rule I didn't remember agreeing to, but was clearly expected to follow. I started keeping the house exactly as it was, afraid that changing too much would be noticed, afraid that not changing enough would also be noticed. And I became careful about routines, waking at the same time, eating at the same hours, moving through the same paths in the house, because unpredictability felt dangerous, like noise in a system that preferred quiet order. It was during this time that I realized the pressure I felt wasn't constant everywhere, that there were places where it grew lighter, almost distant, like the bathroom during the early morning or the corner of the living room where sunlight pooled in the afternoon, and I gravitated toward those spaces without fully understanding why, lingering there longer than necessary, breathing easier, and then feeling the weight return the moment I stepped away, as if something had noticed my relief and corrected it. At night, I began to sense timing again, not in hours but in intervals, stretches where the presence felt closer, stretches where it receded slightly, and I learned to lie very still during the closer moments, barely breathing, counting heartbeats instead of taps, because movement seemed to draw attention, and attention was the one thing I no longer wanted. There were moments, fleeting and confusing, when I thought I heard something like disappointment, not expressed in sound, but in the way the air seemed to sag, and I wondered if my silence wasn't what it wanted, if the rules were shifting again. But I was too afraid to test that theory. I noticed changes in myself that I couldn't easily explain to anyone else, like how my thoughts had slowed, becoming more deliberate, how I weighed every action as if there were consequences I couldn't see, and how the idea of being alone no longer brought comfort, but a heightened awareness, because alone was when the watching felt most focused. Dreams became vivid, but strangely quiet, filled with familiar rooms arranged in slightly wrong ways, doorways leading to places that felt close but unreachable, and I'd wake with the sensation that someone had just left, that I'd missed an important exchange by seconds. One morning, I found 3 faint impressions on my kitchen table, not marks exactly, more like depressions in the wood, arranged in a neat line, and when I pressed my fingers into them, they fit perfectly, as if something had rested there and waited. And I stood there staring until the pressure returned sharply enough to make my eyes water, a reminder that noticing too much carried its own risks. I stopped writing things down after that, because the act of recording felt like acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had always led to escalation, so I kept everything contained in my head, letting details pile up until it felt like my thoughts were crowded, like there wasn't enough room for anything new. Friends drifted away without drama, unanswered messages, accumulating until silence became expected, and I told myself it was easier this way. Fewer variables, fewer witnesses, fewer chances for someone else to notice what I was learning to hide. Sometimes, late at night, I'd feel a subtle shift in the room, like a change in pressure before a storm, and I'd know without seeing that it was closer than usual, not touching, but near enough that the space between us felt charged. And in those moments, I'd become acutely aware of my own body, the sound of my breathing, the way my pulse seemed too loud, and I'd wonder if it could hear me thinking, if the patterns in my mind were as visible as the ones in my behavior. There was a night when the pressure grew so intense that I felt pinned in place, not physically restrained, but unwilling to move. And in that stillness, I sensed something like curiosity, a careful examination, as if it were checking whether I was ready. And the thought that readiness might be expected of me made my chest tighten until breathing felt optional. After that night, I began to feel less like a person living in a house and more like a fixture within it, something that belonged there, something whose presence was accounted for. And the idea crept in slowly that maybe this was what it wanted all along, not entry or interaction but alignment, for my patterns to match its own until the distinction blurred. I started to catch myself pausing before small actions, like reaching for a glass of water or turning on a light, waiting for a sense of permission that sometimes came as a slight easing of pressure and sometimes didn't come at all. And when it didn't, I'd stop, letting thirst or discomfort linger rather than risk whatever consequence came with disobedience. Time lost its edges, days sliding into each other, and the world outside the house began to feel unreal. Too loud, too bright, too unpredictable. And I'd hurry back inside with relief, closing the door gently as if afraid to disturb something already settled. The realization that scared me the most came quietly, without fanfare, one evening as I stood in the hallway and felt the pressure settle around me like a familiar weight. And I understood that I no longer knew where I ended and it began, that the watching had become a shared state, not something imposed, but something maintained, and the fear that once defined my nights had softened into a tense acceptance. Even now, as I sit in the dim light, listening to the subtle sounds that fill the space between silence and noise, I can feel that attention resting on me, patient and steady. And I know that nothing dramatic needs to happen for this to continue. No final reveal or confrontation, just the slow maintenance of patterns, the quiet adherence to rules that were never spoken but are now deeply ingrained. And somewhere in that understanding is the unsettling certainty that whatever has been watching me doesn't need to tap anymore, because it knows exactly how closely I'm already listening. After that point, the sense of continuity fractured even further, because I began to notice that memory itself was changing, not in obvious gaps, but in emphasis, as if certain moments were being highlighted while others faded. And the highlighted ones always involved stillness, compliance, moments when I had chosen not to act, and I would replay them in my head at night, wondering whether the replaying was my own habit or another kind of response, another way of reinforcing the pattern. I stopped checking the time altogether because clocks had become unreliable companions, sometimes jumping forward without explanation, sometimes stalling for long stretches during the night. And instead, I judged hours by the quality of the pressure, by how close it felt, by how heavy the air became in certain rooms. And I learned that there were cycles to it, not daily ones, but longer arcs. Days when it felt withdrawn, and days when it felt intensely present. And I couldn't tell whether those shifts were driven by something external or by changes in me. On the withdrawn days, I felt almost abandoned, restless and uneasy in a different way, pacing the house and listening too hard. And on the present days, I moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to provoke that focused attention. And it occurred to me that either state kept me occupied, kept my thoughts orbiting the same center, and that realization brought with it a dull sense of inevitability. I started noticing small physical sensations that didn't quite belong to me, like a chill that would settle on one side of my body only, or a warmth at my back as if someone were standing close. And when I tried to shift away, the sensation would follow, not chasing, but matching, maintaining that same distance. And it was in those moments that the idea of being watched evolved into something more complex, something like being accompanied. I wondered, sometimes, whether there had been a moment long ago when I could have refused more decisively, slammed doors, shouted, broken the quiet with noise and certainty. But that thought always came paired with an image of escalation, of consequences I was glad to have avoided. And the pairing felt suspiciously complete, as if the argument had been prepared in advance. There were nights when I sensed movement in the house, not footsteps or sounds, but a shifting of presence from one area to another, and I'd lie there, tracking it by feel alone, knowing when it lingered near the bedroom door, knowing when it drifted down the hallway. And each time it moved, I felt a corresponding adjustment in myself, a subtle reorientation, like a compass needle responding to a magnetic field. Once, during a rare afternoon thunderstorm, the power went out, and the house plunged into a deeper darkness than usual. And for a brief moment, the pressure vanished entirely, leaving behind a sudden, dizzying lightness that made my heart race. And I realized then how accustomed I had become to its weight, how its absence felt wrong, destabilizing. And as the pressure returned slowly, almost cautiously, I found myself exhaling in relief, and the shame of that reaction stayed with me long after the lights came back on. After that, I stopped framing it as an enemy or an intruder and started thinking of it as a condition, something like gravity, always there, shaping movement and behavior without malice or kindness, just persistence. And that shift in perspective made it easier to endure, but it also made resistance feel pointless, like trying to argue with the dark. The dreams grew more detailed over time, less symbolic and more procedural, filled with sequences of actions performed in precise order, standing in certain places, waiting for certain intervals. And I'd wake with the strange certainty that I had completed something important while asleep, even if I couldn't remember what. And on those mornings, the pressure would feel especially settled, especially calm, as if satisfied. I began to notice that my reflection no longer lagged in mirrors, but seemed to watch me more intently, eyes tracking my movements with a focus that felt new. And I avoided looking too closely, not because I expected to see something else there, but because I feared recognizing something familiar. Conversations with other people became difficult, not because I had nothing to say, but because words felt inadequate, too blunt to describe the layered quiet I lived in. And when friends asked how I was doing, I'd pause too long before answering, listening inwardly for a cue that never came, and eventually they stopped asking. There were moments, rare but unsettling, when I felt a kind of reassurance emanating from the presence. Not comfort exactly, but a steadying influence. And those moments frightened me more than the nights of intense pressure, because they suggested approval, suggested that I was doing something right. I wondered what would happen if I left again, not just for a night, but permanently. And the thought felt abstract, distant, like imagining a past life, and the ease with which I dismissed it told me more than I wanted to know. One evening, standing in the hallway at the familiar hour when the house felt most attentive, I felt the pressure aligned perfectly with my own stillness. No excess, no resistance, just balance. And in that moment, it was impossible to tell whether I was being watched or whether I was simply holding myself in place. And the ambiguity settled into me like a final rule. Now the nights pass without incident in the way most people would understand it. No tapping, no marks, no sudden sensations dramatic enough to point to, just the constant awareness of being accounted for, of existing within a system of observation that feels as natural as breathing. And even as I sit here now, aware of how this would sound to anyone else, I can feel that steady attention resting on me, patient as ever. And I know that it will continue to rest there long after I stop thinking about it, long after words run out, because whatever began with those first quiet taps has learned all the patterns it needs, and it has no reason to stop watching now. After that point, even the idea of continuation became strange to me, because nothing was clearly progressing in a way I could point to, yet everything was undeniably moving. Like a slow current you only notice once you stop swimming against it. And I began to understand that the presence didn't measure time the way I did, that urgency was a human concept, and patience was its native state. I stopped waiting for something definitive to happen, and started noticing how often I adjusted without being prompted, how I'd pause mid-thought and redirect myself away from questions that felt too sharp, how my body would settle into stillness long before my mind caught up. And that realization unsettled me in a quieter way than fear ever had, because it meant the rules no longer needed reinforcement. They were embedded. The house itself felt increasingly neutral, no longer a place of safety or threat, but a kind of container. And I sensed that if I left it again, the container would simply reshape itself around me somewhere else, not as a pursuit, but as a constant condition, the way silence follows you no matter where you go. I noticed that sounds from outside had begun to feel distant and flattened, like they were passing through a filter before reaching me. And when I stood at the window, watching cars go by or neighbors walk their dogs, there was a strange disconnect, as if I were observing a recorded scene rather than a living one. And behind that sensation was the faint impression that the observing itself was shared. There were nights when I felt the presence settle closer than usual, not encroaching, but aligning. And during those nights, my thoughts would slow to the point where they felt almost synchronized with something else. Gaps forming between them that stretched longer than felt comfortable. And in those gaps, I sensed understanding without language, a mutual awareness that didn't need explanation. I tested this once by deliberately thinking of something loud and chaotic, a memory filled with movement and noise, and the pressure in the room shifted immediately, tightening in a way that felt corrective, not punitive, but firm. And I abandoned the thought instinctively, surprised by how automatic the response was. From then on, I kept my mind orderly, or at least tried to, favoring repetition over novelty, familiar paths of thought that felt safe, and the reward for that effort was a steadiness that bordered on calm, a calm that would have felt like relief if it hadn't carried the weight of dependence. I realized at some point that I no longer checked behind me, no longer scanned rooms for changes, because scanning implied distrust, and distrust created friction, and friction brought a tension of a sharper kind, and the way that logic had arranged itself so neatly in my head made me wonder how long it had been forming. Sometimes I'd catch myself standing completely still for long stretches, not frozen by fear, but simply paused, listening inwardly and outwardly at once. And when I eventually moved again, it felt like resuming a role after a break rather than making a choice. The idea of telling this story at all felt increasingly abstract, because framing it as a story suggested a beginning and an end. And what I was experiencing felt more like a settling into equilibrium, a state that didn't demand resolution. And yet there was a persistent sense that being remembered mattered, that the patterns I embodied were being retained somewhere beyond me. On a few occasions, I became aware of a faint internal echo when I thought certain thoughts, not a voice, but a resonance, like a string vibrating in response to another string nearby. And those moments carried a peculiar intimacy. Not comfort, not menace, just closeness. And afterward, the pressure would feel especially balanced, as if something had aligned properly. I wondered whether this was what the tapping had been preparing me for all along. Not interaction in the usual sense, but attunement, the gradual narrowing of difference until observation and existence occupied the same space, and the thought lingered without panic, which frightened me more than any sudden noise ever could. Now the nights pass with a smoothness that would seem enviable to anyone else. No interruptions, no overt disturbances, just long stretches of quiet awareness. And sometimes, as I lie there, listening to my own breathing, I feel the faint impression of another rhythm matching it, not copying, but coexisting. And I can't tell which one came first. Even as I sit here now letting these thoughts take shape, there's a carefulness in the way they form, a sense of boundaries I don't consciously define but instinctively respect, and somewhere just beyond that carefulness is the steady presence that has been there all along, patient, observant, unhurried, and I know with a certainty that no longer spikes into fear, that it will remain whether I continue speaking or fall silent, whether I remember or forget, because it has learned me completely now, and there is nothing left for it to ask.